A Japanese officer stands over a row of fresh graves on a jungle promontory in the Philippines, and he refuses to believe what he is looking at. His own men had told him this stretch of coastline was secured. His own command had promised that one battalion of experienced infantry could land behind the American lines in a single night and cut off the whole defense of Bataan before dawn. And yet here are the graves, dug by the very Americans his headquarters insisted could not still be fighting in any organized way. He will not sign the report until he sees the cemetery with his own eyes. Because somewhere along this coastline, on a handful of jungle fingers of land the Americans called Longoskawayan Point and Quinawan Point and Anyasan Point, one of the Imperial Army's most experienced infantry battalions had walked into a fight against men who were never trained to fight at all. Pilots, mechanics, sailors with no ship left to sail. And by the time the shooting stopped, Japanese command could not make the arithmetic add up. By January of 1942, General Masaharu Homma had every reason to expect an easy finish to his campaign. His 14th Army had shattered the American and Filipino line at Lingayen Gulf in a single day. Manila had fallen without a fight. Imperial General Headquarters in Tokyo was so confident the Philippines were finished that it had already stripped half of Homma's combat strength away to reinforce the invasion of the Dutch East Indies, leaving him a fraction of his original force and a 50-day deadline to close out the job. One of his own officers described the retreating Filipino and American army as, in his words, a cat entering a sack. All that remained, in his mind, was to tie the sack shut. The problem was, the sack would not close. General Douglas MacArthur's exhausted forces had fallen back onto the Bataan Peninsula and dug in along a line running coast to coast, and for 2 weeks that line had held. So Homma reached for the maneuver that had worked beautifully for Japan everywhere else in the Pacific that winter: land a force behind the enemy's line by sea, sever the supply road, and watch the whole position collapse from the rear. He gave the job to one of his more reliable units, the 2nd Battalion of the 20th Infantry Regiment, roughly 900 combat-tested men under Colonel Nariyoshi Tsunehiro. On paper, it was barely a contest. What Homma did not know yet was who would be waiting on those beaches when his men came ashore, and what that mismatch was about to cost him. To understand what happened next, you have to understand what MacArthur's headquarters actually had left to work with. Every trained infantry regiment in the Philippines was already holding the main defensive line across Bataan, stretched thin and fighting for every yard of it. There was no reserve division sitting behind the front waiting to plug a hole. If Japanese troops got in behind that line, there was, on paper, almost nothing standing between them and the peninsula's last airfields and the harbor at Mariveles. So American commanders did something armies rarely do on purpose. They built an infantry force out of men who were not infantry, fighter pilots and ground crew of the Provisional Air Corps Regiment, grounded because most of their aircraft had already been destroyed in December, were handed rifles and marched to the coast. Sailors from the Asiatic Fleet, stranded once their ships withdrew south, were formed into a naval battalion alongside marine artillerymen and seaplane crews. The Philippine Constabulary, a police force with no combat mission on its books at all, was sent to hold a stretch of beach. The only professional soldiers anywhere in this mix were a detachment of Philippine scouts, Filipino troops trained and led by American officers and widely considered, man for man, the best troops in the entire theater. Leading part of this improvised line was a 24-year-old fighter pilot named Ed Dias, commander of the 21st Pursuit Squadron. 2 weeks earlier, his job had been flying a P-40 Warhawk. Now his job was commanding 218 airmen who had never trained for a ground fight in their lives, holding a beach he had never walked, against an enemy he could not yet see. None of them, Dias included, had any idea that this improvised command was about to become one of the most decorated infantry outfits of the entire Philippines campaign, or that Diaz himself would go on to survive one of the war's worst atrocities and become one of America's first witnesses to it. On the night of January 22nd, the plan that was supposed to end all of this quickly went wrong before it even began. Colonel Tsunehiro's landing barges missed their intended beach at Kaibobo Point entirely, and his battalion came ashore split into two separate, uncoordinated pockets miles apart, one at Longoskawayan Point and another, 7 miles north, at Quinawan Point. Neither group knew exactly where the other had landed. Headquarters back in Manila did not know exactly where either of them was, which meant that from the very first night, the men sent to cut off Bataan's defenders had, without realizing it, cut themselves off instead. For more than a week, that mistake barely seemed to matter, because the improvised American force trying to dig the Japanese out could not make fast progress either. Pilots and mechanics, however brave, were not soldiers. They advanced too slowly, mistimed their attacks, and took losses probing jungle none of them knew how to read. The fight had become, in the words of the men living through it, a stalemate that nobody expected to end well for the side wearing pilots' wings instead of infantry boots. But the same terrain slowing the Americans down was quietly becoming the trap that would finish Tsunehiro's men for good, because it made it just as hard for his own battalion to link its two halves together, resupply, or even understand what was happening to their comrades a few hundred yards away. And on January 27th, hoping to save the situation, Homma made the decision that would turn a stalemate into a massacre. Trying to rescue the trapped battalion, Homma ordered reinforcements, roughly 200 more men, to land near the original beachhead and fight their way through. It was supposed to be a simple relief mission. In practice, the same navigational failure struck twice. The relief force missed its target by nearly 2,000 yards and came ashore instead on a new stretch of coastline between the Anyasan and Silayim rivers, straight into a sector held by yet another improvised American unit, a battalion of Philippine Constabulary Police. While all of this was unfolding on the coast, the rest of Bataan's defenders had problems of their own. Rations across the peninsula had already been cut to half strength by January, and every regular division MacArthur had was locked into the main line, unable to spare a single company for a fight nobody in Manila had planned for. That is the detail worth sitting with. The force fighting to erase an elite Japanese battalion was not a backup plan. It was the only plan left. By now, the fighting across every one of these points had dissolved into something closer to a manhunt through triple canopy jungle than a conventional battle. Visibility ran to a few yards in any direction. Units lost contact with each other constantly. One American signalman, perched on a telephone pole trying to relay his own position, was asked over the radio exactly where he was. His honest answer survives in the record word for word. He had no idea, he said, except that he seemed to be somewhere between Quinawan and Anyasan points, mangling the names into something closer to a punchline than a coordinate. Elsewhere on the same stretch of coast, an infantry officer barked at his mixed-bag command to hold their 5-yard interval in the underbrush, and an exhausted airman, fighting as a rifleman, shouted back that whoever gave that order was welcome to come hold it himself. That was the level of discipline holding this line together. None, on paper, and somehow enough anyway. Weapons shortages forced improvisation that would have been comic if the stakes had not been so serious. When troops recovered 2 air-cooled 50-caliber machine guns salvaged from a wrecked P-40, they discovered there were no tripods left to mount them on. So one soldier strapped the 95-pound gun directly onto his own back, dropped to all fours as a human gun mount, and let a second man climb up behind him to aim and fire it. It looked absurd. It also worked well enough to keep a Japanese position pinned down long enough for help to arrive. Slowly, methodically, the trapped pockets were squeezed. At Longoskawayan Point, isolated and running out of food, the men Tsunehiro had sent to seize the high ground at Mount Pukot found themselves surrounded instead, cut off from resupply, cut off from each other, and cut off from any realistic hope that a relief column would ever reach them. And still, when American interpreters used loudspeakers and sound trucks to call on them to surrender, the answer usually came back as gunfire. Some of the trapped soldiers, out of ammunition entirely, reportedly threw their empty rifles and even their own boots at an approaching American tank rather than raise their hands. When they still refused to move, the tank drove over them. By the final days of January, Homma's operation had stopped being a maneuver and started being a hostage situation of his own making, with his own veteran battalion as the hostage. He had one card left to play: get the rest of Tsunehiro's men, roughly 500 still waiting in reserve, onto the beach at Quinawan Point to break the siege before it finished his battalion off completely. He gave the order. On the night of February 1st, the barges loaded up and set out under a full moon, sailing straight toward the one stretch of coastline the Americans had been watching most closely of all. The convoy never had a chance to be subtle. A clear sky and a full moon turned the water off Quinawan Point into a lit stage, and American coastal observers spotted the flotilla of 13 landing barges the moment it came into range. Word reached General MacArthur's headquarters within minutes, and every piece the Americans had spent days quietly arranging around this exact stretch of beach began to move at once. 4 American P-40 fighters, flown by pilots from the very squadron Ed Dias had once led from the air, dropped out of the dark and swept the barges with fragmentation bombs and .50 caliber fire. Searchlights from shore locked onto the wooden boats and held them there while the rounds walked through the packed decks. Shore-based artillery opened up next, and a single American torpedo boat, PT-32, found the convoy's escort ship in the darkness and forced it to break off entirely. By 3 in the morning it was over. Roughly half of the 500 men in that reinforcement battalion were dead or dying in the wreckage before their boots ever touched Bataan's sand. And when interpreters called out through bullhorns for the survivors floating in the wreckage to surrender, most of the answers that came back were gunshots. The men who did make it ashore scattered onto a new stretch of coast at Silayim Point, joining what was left of the original landing force in a shrinking pocket with no way out, and no one left coming to save them. What followed was not really a battle anymore. It was a systematic elimination. American and Filipino troops, reinforced now by additional infantry, Philippine scouts, and the 17th Pursuit Squadron fighting as riflemen, closed in on the remaining pockets at Quinawan, Anyasan, and Silayim points through the first 2 weeks of February. The Japanese soldiers trapped inside fought with a refusal to surrender that even their own command would later struggle to explain. Wounded men kept firing. Men out of bullets fought with bayonets, with knives, with their bare hands. It cost the defenders real blood to finish the job, but by February 12th, the last organized resistance at every one of the points had been wiped out. Of the roughly 2,000 Japanese soldiers Homma had committed to this operation, the final accounting was almost unbelievable. Somewhere around 1,000 were confirmed dead, 17 were taken prisoner, and by most counts only about 34 men, most of them wounded, ever made it back to their own lines to tell anyone what had happened. Set that against what it cost the defenders. At Longoskawayan Point, the improvised naval battalion lost 22 dead and 66 wounded, holding off 300 Japanese troops. At Anyasan and Silayim, the final toll on the American and Filipino side ran to about 70 dead. One squadron of grounded pilots fighting as riflemen lost less than 1/10 of its own strength, destroying an entire enemy force sent specifically to destroy it. An experienced, reinforced Japanese battalion, one of the more capable units in Japan's 14th Army, had effectively been erased by a defense built out of grounded pilots, stranded sailors, military police, and one detachment of Filipino scouts who were never meant to hold this line alone. Word of the disaster took time to reach Japanese headquarters clearly, and when it did, the reaction was not acceptance, it was disbelief. This detail is preserved in the American Army's own official history of the campaign. Japanese officers, on first learning what had happened to the men sent to Longoskawayan Point, would not accept the reports. According to that record, one Japanese officer refused to believe his battalion had been annihilated until he was taken to the site himself and shown the cemetery the Americans had dug for the Japanese dead. Only standing over it did the arithmetic finally become real to him. An elite infantry unit, trained for exactly this kind of fight, had been wiped out not by rival infantry, but by men whose actual jobs, weeks earlier, had been flying planes, fixing engines, and walking a police beat. For the Americans and Filipinos who won it, recognition followed quickly. Ed Dias and 2 other officers received the Distinguished Service Cross. The enlisted airmen who had fought as riflemen received Silver Stars, an extraordinary decoration for men who had spent most of their military careers on an airfield instead of a battlefield. For General Homma, the outcome was closer to a professional humiliation, and a dangerous one. He belonged to a faction in the Japanese army considered too cautious, too Western-leaning, by rivals back in Tokyo, including General Hideki Tojo, who had little patience for a commander falling behind schedule. The failed landing cost Homma roughly 6 weeks he could not get back, forced him to request reinforcements from a high command already looking for reasons to doubt him, and handed those rivals exactly the kind of failure they had been waiting for. What Homma had planned as a 50-day campaign was, because of 3 weeks on a handful of jungle points nobody in Tokyo could even pronounce, now running badly behind schedule, with his own career riding on the outcome. None of it, in the end, saved Bataan. With no reinforcements and no resupply ever coming from an America still rebuilding its Pacific Fleet, the peninsula's defenders, including the very airmen, sailors, and scouts who had just annihilated an entire Japanese battalion, ran out of food, out of ammunition, and out of options. Bataan fell on April 9, 1942, and its garrison was marched into the atrocity. History remembers as the Bataan Death March. Ed Dias was one of the men on that march, and one of the very few who survived it, escaped Japanese captivity, and lived to tell the world what he had seen. His first-hand account became one of the first public exposures of how Japan was treating its prisoners of war, a story that shaped American opinion for the rest of the conflict, before Dias himself was killed in a flying accident on American soil in December of 1943, never living to see the war's end. That is why this story disappears inside the larger tragedy that followed it. The Battle of the Points was, by almost any honest military accounting, a clean, complete tactical victory, one of the first the Allies scored anywhere against Japan in the Second World War, and it came more than 3 years before Japan's surrender, at a point in the war when Allied victories of any size were rare enough to matter far beyond one jungle coastline. It was won almost entirely by men who were never supposed to be soldiers in the first place, against a battalion that had every reason, on paper, to expect an easy night's work. If a story about pilots and mechanics and stranded sailors quietly outfighting one of the Imperial Army's own battalions is the kind of history you want more of, hit subscribe, because the peninsula that fell in April still has stories like this one buried in it, waiting for someone to stand at the grave and finally believe them.